Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And once again, happy Anilka. We are now beginning the last two plenaries of this spectacular conference. The first plenary is entitled Alaska's Conservation Future, Building on Anilka. It will be facilitated by Bill Meadows, whom I will introduce shortly. And then the second and last plenary is entitled Honoring the Anilka Heroes and Looking to the Future. It's going to be a wonderful grand finale to this event. Let me introduce the head table, then I will introduce Bill Meadows, who will be facilitating our second to the last plenary. To my right is the absolutely incomparable Dr. Ed Wayburn. To his right is the equally incomparable Peg Dialston. And building on Dennis Hayes' comments this morning, we were prepared. We have the future leaders at the head table, Katie Gavanis and Werner Wilson. To my left is the magnificent Bill Meadows. To his left is the distinguished Congressman Souter. To his left is the spectacular former Congressman Tom Evans. To his left is the most special Tom Kiernan. And finally, Helen Nienhauser, whom you met this morning, who is the incoming chair of the Alaska Conservation Foundation. Bill Meadows has been the president of the Wilderness Society since 1996. He has been active in conservation for over 30 years, first as a volunteer leader at the Sierra Club in his native state of Tennessee. He is a member of the board of the League of Conservation Voters and the chair of its political committee. He also serves on the boards of the Campaign for America's Wilderness, the American Wilderness Coalition, the Murie Center, and Americans for Our Heritage and Recreation. Bill is a great conservationist, a great conservation leader, and passionately cares about Alaska. I also have been so privileged the last 6.5 years to have Bill as a colleague. Bill Meadows.
I don't think I've heard as many wonderful adjectives ascribed to the head table. Thank you very, very much, Deborah. And thank you, Deborah, for being such a grand leader, committed. Deborah's not only a grand leader, she's a committed conservationist, superb colleague, and good friend. We're indebted to you for your work on behalf of conservation, Alaska, and our nation. The theme today, Alaska's Conservation Future, is actually a question. And I believe the answer will be a positive one, thanks to Deborah's work with the Alaska Conservation Foundation. We can be optimistic about that future because of the focus and strength Deborah Williams has brought to the Alaska conservation community. Thank you, Deborah. magnificent, spectacular, most special. Incomparable. Seated next to we are honored to have Congressman Souder and former Congressman Evans offer their perspectives on this future as well. But I will begin offering a message of hope. I'm honored to be here with you today to try to add a grace note to the extraordinary celebration of Anilka and Alaska we have experienced this week. I'm privileged to be here representing the spirited people of the Wilderness Society. Alaska is not just a passion for us, it is part of our organizational DNA. In the 1920s, two of our early leaders, Marty and Olis Murray, spent their honeymoon exploring the great land by dog sled and became vocal advocates for protecting the far north ever after. Conservation patriarch Bob Marshall hiked the Brooks Range in the early 1930s, long before the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was even conceived. He then used his passion for Alaskan wilderness to help found the Wilderness Society in 1935. We care because Alaska epitomizes the pristine, unspoiled wilderness that is so massive, so spectacular, that we may never comprehend its natural bounty. When the conference organizers invited me to make this presentation, they asked me to offer a message of hope. A difficult assignment, to be sure, during these tough times for conservation in America. I will start by evoking the spirit of some of our own elders who are no longer with us, but whose radiant light still guides us today. Marty Murray, Celia Hunter, Peggy Wayburn, to name just three. They laid the groundwork for hope. And Gaylord Nelson, my colleague at the Wilderness Society, Gaylord died this past Sunday. We truly lost one of the founding fathers of the modern environmental community. I was blessed to be a child of the 60s and mature at the time of Earth Day, which he founded in 1970. That started me in my career in conservation. He was instrumental in changing the dynamics of the environmental policy debate in this country beginning in 1970 and changed an entire generation of political debate. He's not only influenced his own generation, but my generation and the generations to follow. We will miss him. I would be remiss not to once again recognize the immense contributions made by President Jimmy Carter, whose passion, bold vision, and political will changed the land conservation dynamic in Alaska forever. There are other stellar leaders of our movement, too numerous to mention by name, many of whom are in this room right now. People like Ed Wayburn, who in his great wisdom after Anilka finally passed, commented that the legislation signaled the coming of age of our country's environmental conscience. Thank you, Ed. But take a look at the people sitting to your left and to your right. These are the conservation heroes of 2005, whose tireless work is lifting Alaska to the future. The sea of faces before me is exactly where I find hope. Not in the political winds that can change with the twinkling of an eye, not in the tally of red or blue states, or the dissection of the latest court decision, or the latest vote on an appropriations amendment. Our hope for Alaska, our hope for fulfilling the dream of Anilka lies with people, the tens of thousands of Americans living here and in the lower 48 who embrace a conservation ethic and who choose to act on it. If there is a lesson to be learned in the 2004 elections, it is that when the American people have an opportunity to express themselves on conservation issues, conservation wins. The nationwide measure of this past election was that more than 70% of all local and state conservation initiatives were approved by voters. It is only when conservation becomes entangled with other issues such as terrorism, war, and the economy that voters become challenged by the lack of a clear up or down vote on the environment. 70% is surely a reason for hope. Please don't misunderstand me. I do not in any way want to minimize the enormous challenges our community is facing. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is under siege. This administration has handed out permits to drill for oil and gas on federal lands, the lands that belong to all of us, like candy. There's a disingenuous push to cut the public out of decision-making processes and to reinterpret that ultimately underline bedrock environmental laws and regulations, all in the name of efficiency. The bottom line is that millions of acres of land that the federal government oversees on behalf of all American people, the vast landscapes ANILCA protected and largely kept intact, have become pawns in a political struggle, pitting the short-term interest of resource extractors against the long-term interest of every U.S. citizen, our wildlife species, and the land. We have our work cut out for us. My proposition to you is that the solution to these problems lies in community. Community that embraces both people and wilderness. One of our forefathers, the conservation giant Aldo Leopold, said it best: when we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. What drives the divide in this country over land preservation is, I believe, the difference in emphasis between the good of the commons, the community, versus an emphasis on the good or the perceived good of the individual. Our job as conservationists is to demonstrate that the individual is inextricably linked to this larger community of life, and that human ambitions do not have to collide with the natural world. Preserving the natural world should be an indispensable part of those ambitions, for therein lies our future. What better place than Alaska, an international icon for wilderness, do we have the opportunity to prove this truth? I posit that this is the place, and that a constellation of circumstances have converged to make this the moment for us to act. It is time that we recognize the significance of wilderness to community, specifically to Native peoples and rural residents who depend on its manifold values for survival. We have spoken today of subsistence, the wilderness that ANILCA designated, and the wilderness quality lands still left in Alaska, which have yet to become part of the National Wilderness Preservation System, are the critical nexus where protecting the land and protecting a people intersect. Sites and species we are working to defend, like the porcupine caribou herd that calves on the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and the fertile areas surrounding Tashekpuk Lake and NPRA, are lifelines for people with distinct ethnic heritages. We must build communities of local citizens to engage in these governmental processes that will result in conservation. 25 years after the passage of ANILCA, the land management plans for Alaska's parks and wildlife refuges are up for revision. Designed originally in the era when James Watt came to power, these documents have never gone through a cycle where conservation is dominant. And the threats in 2005 were not even imagined during those earlier days. Roads and access issues, unfettered off-road vehicle use, RS-2477 claims, industrial tourism, and new technologies that can unleash resource extraction in literally every corner of our public lands. A failure to influence land use planning decisions in Alaska is a certain step toward the slow and steady erosion of ANILCA. Our scientists must develop the intellectual capital to create a new economic paradigm around wildland conservation. It is incumbent upon us to prove the market value of sustaining healthy ecosystems and to develop solutions and alternatives that will accommodate both land conservation and economic development. Building community in this state may be dependent on answering the one seminal question: must Alaska choose between jobs and its environment? Our movement must better understand where and how its landscape priorities contribute to the Alaskan economy through activities such as fishing, tourism, and subsistence, and where we can support development because the conservation priorities are lower. We must engage now. We must engage a new and broad range of citizens to create a face of conservation that looks more like Main Street America. Little of what we accomplish during the next decade will endure without the active involvement of a wide range of local citizens over time. The mystery and allure of natural Alaska captivate millions around the world, but countless misperceptions still persist about the conservation community's real agenda, an agenda that could protect its wonders in perpetuity. If all politics is local, then the preservation of Alaska must begin in state, giving voice to the thousands of citizens living in Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau, Ketchikan, and small towns stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Kenai Peninsula, who are not solely pro-development, residents who recognize the symbiotic relationship between wild, healthy ecosystems and a way of life they cherish. We must ask ourselves if we can begin to embrace members of the hunting, tourism, commercial fishing, and even the timber communities who believe, as we do, that the environment is a bipartisan, life-affirming issue. When we can set our differences aside, and when loving the land becomes the sole prerequisite for activism, then those who have felt overlooked may stand alongside us. Finally, we must understand that residents of the lower 48 states have an equal and large share in the future of our last frontier. One must be impressed by what the Alaska Coalition, active in more than 30 states with hundreds of organizations, thousands of volunteers, have been able to achieve. Just look at the energy, focus, and visibility it brings to the Arctic refuge debate. Our aim should be to solidify, diversify, and energize this base of support to convince a broader swath of Americans that the great Alaskan wilderness is theirs too, to defend or to lose. The voices calling for conservation in Alaska are not yet large enough or loud enough to ensure its security long term. But with good information, effective outreach, and potent, trustworthy communications, the debate and the politics will surely change. The seeds of change are real, and with time and determination, I believe that Alaska will someday live as close to the hearts of all American people as places like Yellowstone and Grand Canyon do today. I began this talk by speaking of hope and of those individuals who were pathfinders. I will end it by saying something about my personal experiences in Alaska. I have been blessed to witness grizzly bears in Katmai and wolves in Denali. I've tramped through the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge with Alan Smith to catch sight of the caribou herd. These small glimpses of this staggeringly beautiful state have drawn me back again and again, and they continue to renew my passion for this work, to ensure that Alaska will be Alaska with all that term evokes for the many generations that follow us. I am personally honored to be a member of this august community sitting here in this room because you represent our finest hope for the future. Thank you for everything that you do to keep Alaska wild. You give us all hope. Thank you. It is my pleasure next to introduce my colleague, Tom Kiernan. Tom came to the National Parks Conservation Association about a year after I came to the Wilderness Society, and we embraced each other as newcomers on the block and learned together. We have become avid conservationists at the national scene together. Tom is a wonderful colleague, a wonderful friend, and he is going to introduce Congressman Mark Souder. Tom.
Thank you very much, Bill. It is my honor to introduce Congressman Mark Souder here today because of the deep respect I have for his leadership in the House of Representatives. There are two parts of this introduction that I want to do. One is kind of the official, factual bio stuff, and I'll be quite quick on that. And the other is to share with you the depth and breadth of Congressman Souder's passion for our national parks of this country. On the bio side, quickly, he is a graduate of Indiana University, MBA from Notre Dame, is serving in Congress, I believe now his 6th term as a Republican from Indiana, serves on the committee in the House on Education and Welfare, the Committee on Homeland Security, and is the chair of the Government Reform Subcommittee on Criminal Justice, Drug Policy, and Human Resources, which has a huge agenda, and I think he'll talk briefly about that as well. Enough with the factual bio. On the national park passion side, Congressman Souder is co-founder of the National Parks Caucus in the House of Representatives, co-founded a couple years ago with Congressman Brian Baird. They now have several dozen members working together to reach out to their colleagues, to educate them on the power, the importance, and the needs of our national parks throughout this country and very much here in Alaska. Based on that backdrop, he co-authored and introduced the National Parks Centennial Act, now also introduced on the Senate side. On the House side, because of his leadership, there's a strong bipartisan group of 50 initial co-sponsors on that bill that would provide $600 million more per year, ultimately, for the funding and management of our national parks. As well, given his perch in the chairmanship of the Government Reform Subcommittee, he has launched the largest congressional inquiry ever into the financial needs of our national park system. He has held 2 hearings so far, is planning another 6 over the next 2 years, and perhaps more after that. Congressman Souder is a true leader and a true national parks fanatic. I'm thrilled to present to you Congressman Mark Souder.
Thank you very much. I first want to acknowledge my district director, who's out here with the camera. He was my campaign manager, a longtime friend, and has run my district office during my career. And is up to see Alaska, the home of his ancestor, Judge Wickersham. His name is Mark Wickersham. So we have an Alaska present. The way you know, if those of you who are yet to have children, if you have a baby budding politician, if he comes out in a briefcase and when you open it up, he's got, if it's a male, a suit and tie on, you know you got a politician. We do this everywhere. So it's just standard wear. I know it's not in Alaska, but it is in Indiana and Washington. Also, one of my initial exposures to Alaska was, this is my 4th visit, but a few years ago we drove up the Alaska Highway, and as we came in, one of the first gift shops said, "Welcome to Alaska, the last foreign nation still friendly to the United States." Clearly they hadn't met Chairman Young. Having served on the Resources Committee with Don Young, it was quite of an experience, and it's been fun to get to know him in Congress. And I remember one day when we were debating trapping legislation, he got all emotional on the floor. He said, "I bet I'm the only one here who lived on subsistence living through trapping." We all looked at each other and said, "Yeah, he's probably got us on that one." What's amazing about his presence is that whether you agree with him or not, the fact is he's one powerful big Alaskan, and that, in fact, with just 1 seat in Congress, you have a whole lot more compared to most states. He's like a delegation of 10, and that your senators as well. And I hope whatever your views are on the particular policies, your legislative delegation, to the chagrin of all the other states, is very envious of what your delegation does for the state of Alaska. That part of the reason they've been successful is, in fact, Alaska is in the imagination. Even if people haven't visited here, they want to visit here, and they feel more ties to Alaska, sometimes to chagrin of Don Young, but the fact is who feels that once in a while when he gets really upset, he said, I voted against statehood and I was right. That because he doesn't want to be micromanaged, which is a standard pattern. But the fact is we all are part of the United States, and part of the reason more money comes up here, and part of the reason the Alaska delegation is so effective, is so many Americans look at Alaska and see it as our last great wilderness in this beautiful state. Yes, you have very important resources, and it's something that has to be worked through. But in fact, Anilka will go down in most Americans' minds, particularly those who look at history, as certainly one of the most important environmental pieces of legislation there have ever been. We can talk about other pieces, whether it's the creation of the National Park Service, the Wilderness Act, whether it's Clean Air, Clean Water Acts, but this is certainly one of the most unique acts in the world. Just like the creation of the National Park Service was itself a model for the world, so was Anilka. With me, when I first started looking at this and sat on the Resources Committee and realized that when Don was chairman, half of our hearings were going to be about Alaska, and sat through even the two islands and the Pribilofs getting a fight, and Don beating the table saying, you didn't come 4,000 miles to carry your local arguments, you're here to sell Alaska, not fight with each other. That as we listen to the Alaska debates, it reminded me of reading the history of the Northwest Ordinance in Indiana and the Midwest in 1787, because there was the first addition to the original United States. And the question is how are we going to divide the land? And there were several things that you had in common. There were land grant areas for colleges. There were areas that the railroads got. There were areas for private development. And you were going through this like 200 years later. And it was amazing to watch this. Two things you did right that we didn't do in Indiana. You attempted to work with the Native Americans as opposed to just drive them out, kill them, and give them a few trinkets and beads, which was a big advance. The second thing is, even though they aren't necessarily happy with all the different things, they've been treated as partners as they went through this, which we didn't do in the lower 48. The second thing is setting aside public lands. This was a big step which hadn't been done as we did the other annexations into the United States and as we worked through how those annexations were going to be done. If you want to know the difference in Indiana, counting our national parks, our one national wildlife area, wilderness area, which is about 100 acres, which wouldn't even be big enough to be considered an inholding in Alaska, that as you look at our state parks, as you look at our county parks, our city parks, and our township parks, our total public land in the state of Indiana is 3%. When I sat on resources, Greg Walden had, I think, 89 in the eastern part of Oregon, and Jim Gibbons had 97. He had everything but Las Vegas and Nevada, which means he had part of Las Vegas too, because there isn't much else in Las Vegas, in Nevada, besides people-wise for a congressional district. Now, when you hear 3%, you go, this was, we basically tore down the trees, chased out the bears, chased out the buffalo. In our state logo, you'll see a buffalo there, but buffalo, we still grow them, but they're different. They're more like cattle. And that buffalo roaming means he gets a couple table lengths to roam. It is a different type of a concept because we didn't look at preservation in those terms. Now we have to buy that area back, frog by frog, tree by tree, dune by dune, as we try to create more areas in the eastern United States. So part of the reason I wanted to come to honor Anilka is that you set a pattern for how to look at this. And now as you work through the difficulties, and admittedly there are, Wrangell St. Elias is a huge challenge. The inholdings in Wrangell St. Elias are as big as our next biggest park in the lower 48. It's as big as Yellowstone. I mean, just like Massachusetts had its pilgrims, you do too. In fact, when I visited Wrangell St. Elias, I paid a parking fee to people who I found out didn't own the land any more than I did. It is a huge challenge as you walk through these issues, but it is important, and the rest of the country is watching how you resolve your differences, because as we work through similar difficult issues, particularly east of the Mississippi, where there's tremendous conflict over every acre of land that we try to do it, we're looking to Alaska and say, how are you working it out with your communities? How do you work out the things that were left unresolved to be debated in Alaska? So it's important that we watch that. But I also wanted to move to the next step, and that is that Tom, in his very kind introduction, mentioned three different things, and I want to touch on those three things. The one thing is look, I'm not, with all due respect, probably like most of you. I'm a fundamentalist, evangelical Christian, right-wing Republican who'd Ronald Reagan's speech for Barry Goldwater, and that's what got me involved in politics. Anybody else here with that background? That one of the things in trying to relate to this is, as we move forward on these issues, as Bill said in his speech, we can't lose some element of bipartisan. I mean, we're going to fight over elements of this, but if we don't move forward and understand the basic importance of the wonderful resources we have in the United States and protect them, our kids won't have anything. And that it can't be a tussle of one side wins and pounds the other into the ground, and the other side wins and pounds the other ground, or we'll just go back and forth. Snowmobiles tearing up Yellowstone, then they're banned, then they're tearing up Yellowstone, then they're banned. That type of yo-yo isn't going to work for the environment. And somehow we've got to find ways on things where we can agree, work on those, and then continue to argue about the things where we can't. Well, that was some of the philosophy behind our National Parks Caucus, because there's no question that uniformly we have agreement on the national parks and the importance of that. If there's a vote up, we'll always win the vote. Now, precisely what that means, does it mean wilderness protection or does it mean usage, is in debate, like it was when it was founded. Just like when Jim Ridenhour said park barreling, shoot, park barreling started in the first 4 parks. The fact is these tensions are there, but basically people love their parks, and it's a place for us to build on. And we want to try to, on a regular basis, educate other members about the challenges that are in those parks. I was just talking to Lynn Scarlett as we left here. Many people don't realize the parks are the second biggest place next to Smithsonian for art, and how we can highlight both art about the parks, but art that's preserved in the parks, whether it's Henry Jackson or whether it's Ansel Adams or whether it's Thomas Hill, Moran, wherever, and get that out into some of the halls of Congress, get it out around the United States in exhibits, and continue to build an understanding of the wonderful National Park Service. And we need to do part of this on the Hill. So we bring up superintendents when they come in. We work with NPCA and other groups to educate members, and particularly staff. Members, if we weren't ADD when we got elected, we're ADD after we get elected. And then as a former staffer, what you do is you educate the staff and hope it sinks into the member too. Now, the second thing I want to talk about are our hearings. That in the subcommittee I have, predominantly we do narcotics policy, but I also have jurisdiction over the national parks. The first 2 hearings were to, if that surprises you, in Congress you have authorizing, which basically would shape a bill, appropriating that would appropriate it, and then government reform and oversight does the looking to see that the executive branch is implementing the legislation the way it was authorized, appropriated, and oversight. Now that's the way it's supposed to work. In reality, we're all mixed up because I have some authorizing on the drug policy and some oversight. But in oversight, my subcommittee has literally anything that touches narcotics. We also have the Justice Department, the Education Department, HHS, HUD. I did have Commerce, but I traded Commerce to get national parks, the Smithsonian's, NEA, PBS, and all that. Bottom line, and faith-based office. You have a lot of ability to roam, and it always makes people nervous because other committees think you shouldn't be doing it. So, for example, probably the most famous recent hearing we did was on steroids, where I got to ask Mark McGuire about his past. And other committees said, why are they doing that? Well, a similar thing has been going through in the parks because nobody's ever done oversight for the parks outside of the Resources Committee. So first we established, look, we can do oversight. Ultimately, the Centennial Bill has to move through resources, but we're going to systematically look at the state of the National Park Service around the country and figure out how we work out this huge challenge on funds. Now, let me talk a bit about the Centennial Bill. The goal here is to work for towards the National Park Centennial. It's not exactly Mission 66. We're not going to build all modernistic buildings with high ceilings that are impossible to heat, in places where you don't necessarily want them built. But the goal is to do some of beyond what we talk about in backlog, because you always hear about backlog. Well, there's a funny thing about backlog. It never stops. And if you don't take care of what you're working on daily, your backlog actually gets bigger if you devote all your funds to working on the backlog. So, for example, in the highway bill, we don't have enough funds in to keep some of the roads going. So that means we'll have a bigger backlog because we didn't deal with, I don't know what you call it, the front log. And so while we're supposedly diverting money to the backlog, in fact, if we're not doing the basic maintenance of the Park Service on an annual basis, for example, healthcare, pensions, are a huge increase in cost as our Park Service ages. As we do Homeland Security, you know, they aren't threatening to bomb the local city hall in Ligonier, Indiana. They're threatening to hit the Gateway Arch, Statue of Liberty, Golden Gate Bridge, things in Washington. The Park Service had a huge bump up in Homeland Security costs. The challenge of we constantly add, which I believe is right, and I voted for them, additional things to the Park Service. So while we've been able to get additional money for the Park Service, one of only 3 or 4 discretionary funding categories that have increased, breast cancer, AIDS, Africa, parks, and maybe if I could think of another, I would say it. But basically, there haven't been much increases in Congress. But the Park Service, while it's increasing it at close to a 4% rate over the last few years, as Congressman Lewis and I have asked for additional funding, working with MPCA, the fact is it isn't keeping up. We're adding space that much, yet alone the Homeland Security, the health pension, the other costs, so what we see is a decline in services. Now, realistically, you've got to look at America and say, this isn't going to be easy. It isn't going to be like the old days. Since I've come here 24 hours ago, I've either done or had refused to do media calls on meth, which has been a big issue, on DC gun ban, on CAFTA, the Central American Agreement, and why I won't vote for it unless they do something about trade with China, base closing that affects my district, that's just since I've landed here. They want me to do a call into my biggest radio station, biggest show in the morning, 5:45 Alaska time, on the London bombing that killed at least 45 people and 300 injured. I'm on the Homeland Security Committee. I've worked as one of the main leaders on border issues. And that gives you an idea that, look, the financial pressures, I didn't even mention health care, Social Security, Medicare, gas prices, education, that what we're competing here is that this is a zero-sum game, and that while we try to increase the dollars in the United States, and if we don't, it will really be a zero-sum game, that this is difficult. But unless groups like yours, unless conferences like yours uphold things that have worked and say, look back on this. Don't just look at your daily lives. Look back 25 years ago. If you hadn't done this, where would Alaska be? What would we be passing on? And we need to ask ourselves that same question regarding our national parks, not just in Alaska, but in all 50 states and in our territories. That after we get done with our day-to-day grind, after we deal with these crises of the moment that seem huge and that are important, because if we all die, it won't much matter to our kids or potential kids about the Park Service. So we have to do the other things, but we can't forget about the legacy of the land, the legacy of our wilderness, the fish and wildlife in our country, the beautiful areas that, in my opinion, God created and God wants us to protect. And that's why I'm doing this. That's why we need your help in getting a hold of your congressmen. In the Senate, we have McCain and Feinstein, Alexander, Salazar leading in the House. We have 19 Republicans in our mix of 44 sponsors. We're trying to keep it as close to balance as we can so we don't scare off all the Republicans. And over half of those Republicans are from the conservative faction of the party, which is a big step. At the end of the day, this centennial bill says that we're going to increase the funding each year to 2015 to get the basic sustenance of the Park Service covered. And then we're also going to ask the general public to contribute to that. I don't know what final form this will take, whether it'll be a match form, the federal government will make up the difference. But we're saying, if you love your parks, put your money where your mouth is. Your private money and your public money, and together we can preserve our wonderful land for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you very much.
We need more evangelical ministers like Mark. I am reminded, I don't know if Jonathan Solomon is still here, but several years ago, the Wilderness Society sponsored an event in Boston, and we were actually honoring Paul Sangas for his leadership on Anelka. And of course, this was in recognition of all he had done, although he had been long since dead. Jonathan spoke and was just really inspiring, as only he can be. But at the beginning of his speech, he proclaimed that he too was a born-again Christian, fundamental Christian, was a Republican, and then spoke from those values. And after his speech, he received a standing ovation. After which someone came to me and said, "It's the first time I've ever been in Boston and a born-again Christian Republican has gotten a standing ovation." So, Mark, it's great. We've experienced a number of passionate presentations today, and Mark's was another, and I just so impressed by the quality and the substance of the conversations that we've had and the presentations, the people who have spoken to us. I want to tell you that in my work in Washington, D.C., working on conservation issues, I come across a lot of passionate people. But, you know, there are few who match the passion of Tom Evans. Tom is going to be our next speaker. Tom was really present at the birth of Anelka. He was in Congress, was the Republican floor manager for the legislation. He knows Anelka and its various progressions through the months and years. He guided it through, and he has, since then, for 25 years, worked in its implementation. He's working with us today. He is comes down from Delaware, where he is retired. I don't know that you can say Tom is retired. That's not really fair. I don't think he'll ever retire. But where he is living now, and from where he was elected to Congress. But he comes down and works on behalf of Alaska issues, on behalf of conservation, on behalf of Anelka. I am really pleased to be able to introduce Tom Evans to this august group. Tom Evans.
Thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate all the fabulous work that you do in the Wilderness Society. And, Mark, thank you for your work in the park system. I think it's great. You feel kind of small in Indiana compared to Alaska. What do you think I feel in Delaware compared to Alaska? And thank you, Deborah. You are very, very, very special, and I am unequivocally, and I know all of us are very unequivocally proud and grateful for your work. Enough adjectives there. And Dr. Rayburn, I am in your area in Washington that you contributed about every day during the week, and thank you so very, very much, and thank all of you for the wonderful work that you do. It's inspiring indeed. President Carter was so inspirational, I thought, yesterday, but all of you are. I think we're inspiring one another, really, here in Anchorage, because we've got a very important objective to achieve. And that is to protect some of the things that we've been given. Bill didn't say anything about the fact that I play a little golf since I'm retired, but I do play a little golf, and I wanted to tell you a story about an older gentleman who'd played with this same foursome for about 60 years. And on the way to the club, he couldn't remember his partner's name that he'd played it with for so very, very long, and putting on his golf shoes, he didn't know what the heck he'd do. He got them on and walked toward the first tee and said, well, I'm thinking to myself, I've got to just tell you the truth. And so he got to his partner, he shook hands with him, and he said, I have to tell you the truth. I've forgotten your name. Would you please tell me what it is? And he looked back at him and he said, how soon do you need to know? Well, you know, if we really want to all out in stem cell research and some things like that, we might improve things a bit in terms of memories. But let's turn that around and say, how long will it be before the administration gets it? How long will it take them to understand that conserving and preserving is a conservative thing to do? And how long will it be for the Bush administration and the Republican leadership in Congress to remember that the Republican Party has a great heritage in preserving the natural resources we have been given so generously? They should remember that great conservationist and Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, and all that he did. And another Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, who set up the acreage in the original acreage in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And don't forget Richard Milhouse Nixon. You know, he gets a pretty bad rap for a lot of people, for a lot of tough things that he did. But you know, the Native Alaskans owe him a lot. And the Environmental Protection Agency was a huge step for this country, and it happened under Richard Nixon. So we do have a and preserving natural resources, caring about the environment, shouldn't be a partisan issue. Caring about the environment and conservation, they belong to all of us, to Republicans, to Democrats, and independents alike. And perhaps if President George W. Bush and people like Dr. Frist, Mr. DeLay, were able to understand better that preserving natural resources is important for future generations of Americans, they might have second thoughts about drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. Perhaps if they were influenced a little less by large amounts of dollars received from companies like Exxon. Perhaps if they listened less to my former colleague and friend Dick Cheney, our vice president, as former head of Halliburton Oil Services Company, when he headed the Energy Task Force several years ago, he told us that conservation is only a personal virtue. It does nothing to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. That's what he said. What planet is he on? I think Pluto's farthest away. Maybe that's it. And maybe, perhaps, if the president and vice president and others were to read some of Debbie Miller's wonderful children's books, they might change their minds. And perhaps if we could dispel some myths that the administration and the leadership in Congress seem to be buying, we might change their minds. I hope so. Myth number one: there's a substantial amount of oil in the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And if only we could drill there, we'd resolve all of our energy problems. Whoa. Well, you know, remember the California energy crisis several years ago? I remember it very well because we were told that if only we could drill in the Arctic, we could resolve that energy crisis. I might also add that there was certainly an implication that one of the benefits from invading Iraq would be lower gasoline prices. That turned out to be false as well. And unfortunately, I think we've made this world a much more dangerous place to live. We already have a glut of oil in the world today. The problem is not supply. The problem is the ability to refine it. And there is just plain not a substantial amount of oil in UNWR. At best, it will only supply maybe 3 to 4% of our energy needs in America. And it won't come on stream for 8 to 10 years at a minimum. Conoco and British Petroleum, to their great credit, are not even going to bid on those leaseholds. We should applaud them, ladies and gentlemen. And why in the world would we even think about destroying something so very special unnecessarily? For misguided greed, perhaps? Why in the world don't we raise fuel economy standards just a couple of miles per gallon? Just a couple. And why don't we put a little more air in our tires? I know Savannah from the west coast of Florida. I was with her twice this winter when we were going around speaking at a couple of rallies down there. She's incredible. And these types of things would be worth more in developing energy independence than all the oil we could ever find in the Arctic. And my friends, if we had a major push in developing alternative sources of energy, we'll create thousands and thousands of jobs in science and engineering. And I might add that many of those jobs could and should be right here in this magnificent state of Alaska. The mullahs in the Middle East certainly don't want us to wean ourselves away from our consumption of oil, that's for sure. Incredibly, we consume 25% of all the energy produced in the world. And yet we're 5% of the world's population. Think about it. That should tell us something. We must and we can do better, and we can lead. The United States should lead, and we ought to reconsider Kyoto. Myth number 2. Drilling in the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge will not be harmful to this beautiful, fragile plain or any of the creatures there. If you believe that, I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. And better yet, one of those bridges from nowhere to nowhere that some politicians would like to build here in Alaska. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is fiscal insanity. The fact is that oil companies can drill on a 2-acre footprint, And 1,000 wells would mean only 2,000 acres. That's still a lot of acres. That doesn't sound like very much, though, when you're talking about millions of acres. And that's exactly what the advocates of drilling want you all to think. They want the Americans to think that. Don't you believe it, because it's only the tip of the iceberg. The irreversible, the irreparable harm that occurs primarily from the logistical support for the drilling, the interconnected pipes, the roads, the trucks, the helicopters, the planes, the noise they all make, and the airfields. That's what causes the damage, or most of the damage. And in the Arctic, it is irreversible. And this list of dangers doesn't include a major oil spill. We had an anniversary of the Exxon Valdez spill in March of this year. And that spill was catastrophic. Why take the chance again? And by the way, we've not treated our Native Americans very well in this country, in their country. The Gwich'in tribe who live in the refuge will have their culture, their livelihoods destroyed, and for what? More profit for Exxon? Well, ladies and gentlemen, should we give up? Should we roll over? Should we accept what some call an inevitable result? That's what our adversaries want. They want us to feel that we can't be successful. I say we must never, never, never give up. Two minutes. I know all of you who have done so much to preserve this great American treasure, feel the same way. So all of us must speak for those who have no voice. The mother polar bear with her newborn cub has no voice. The caribou with her newborn calf has no voice. The grizzlies that was so magnificently described by Richard Nelson earlier today. The songbirds, the 180 different species of birds that spend some time here in the summer. We must prevail for them, and most importantly, we must prevail for future generations. Future generations of Americans have no voice yet. We have two opportunities to prevent this insanity, and they're coming up soon. The budget resolution will be coming up again in the House and Senate, and in it includes drilling in the Arctic. That vote is going to take place this fall. Between now and then, we must act individually and collectively to tell the real truth about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The American people need to send an unmistakable message to Congress and to the Bush administration. It must begin with all of you who care so much. Come to Washington, make your plans now. Come to the rally on September the 20th, and come in and speak to your members of Congress. We have 2.5 months to organize and 2.5 months to plan. And in the meantime, call and write members of Congress. It does make a difference. Let them know that you really care. Let them know that this is the top priority that you have. And call radio talk shows. Write letters to the editors of your newspapers. Share your thoughts with your friends and neighbors. Use the email. Use the chat rooms. and ask your friends to do the same. And by the way, raise some dollars. Give what you can afford, and a little more, perhaps. It'll really help, and we really need it. There's my contribution. One more minute. One more minute. Let me leave all of you all with a thought, because you've been so inspiring to me, and you've really gladdened an old heart that's going to last for a long time. Our destiny as a nation doesn't lie in plundering the natural resources that we have been so graciously bequeathed, but rather in doing everything possible to preserve and protect these natural treasures for all God's creatures. With your help, I know we can win, and I wish you all Godspeed. Thank you very much.
Let me close by bringing us back to the beginning, Alaska's conservation future. Tom laid out a challenge. I look at this work we do sort of in three phases. We do have places that must be defended. There are policies that must be defended. ANILCA is one of those. Arctic Refuge is one of those. There are opportunities for good conservation. ANILCA made that possible. Let's act on that. And we need to look to the future. It's this community. It's the broader community. We're going to hear from the youngest community, and we've heard from the oldest community. We have here, seated next to Ed Wabron, the future of conservation for Alaska. That includes Peg, youthful Peg. I can say this, I now have gray hair and none. But it is this community that has an opportunity to, I think, shape the conservation debate, shape the conservation politics, not only in Alaska but in the country. This is a wonderful base from which to build. I think having 1,000 people present yesterday, the conservation community, to hear President Carter is just inspiring to us all. And to have this conference be so successful, so substantive, so stimulating, inspires us all. And Deborah, I thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you so much, panelists. That was a tremendous second to the last plenary, but now we're ready for our last plenary. Honoring the ANILCA champions and looking to the future. To do the honoring of ANILCA champions portion of this plenary, I have the great privilege of introducing Peg Tileston, who has been involved in Alaska conservation issues since arriving in the state in 1972. Peg has launched so many organizations in Alaska, including the Alaska Center for the Environment, Trustees for Alaska, Alaska Conservation Foundation, and Alaska Common Ground, where she chairs that organization currently. Peg is a trustee emeritus of Alaska Conservation Foundation and has served on a number of state and local advisory boards, including the Alaska Water Resources Board, Oil and Gas Policy Council, and the Natural Gas Pipeline Council. Last year, Peg was the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award and thus inducted into the Alaska Conservation Hall of Fame. Peg has been quoted as saying, "Identify a need, determine what would take care of it, and organize a response." That's the creed by which Peg Tileston has guided Alaska's conservation movement. Thank you so much, Peg. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everything you have done.
And I ain't done yet. I think I've made Deborah's day. She said, "How long are you going to speak?" And I said, "Not long." Of course, it may be in .8 type, but it isn't. What a marvelous experience this has been. What a marvelous celebration. And you know, these things don't happen overnight. They take a lot of planning and a lot of work on the part of ACF and a lot of people. And I really think that, we really need gatherings like this and elections, because that's where we see our friends. You know, all those fundraisers you have to go to, you got a chance to see people you haven't seen for the last 4 years or 2 years. Thank you all for coming. It's been sort of like a family reunion. You see, again, people that you haven't seen for a long time. There's some people here that I haven't seen, I think, for 4 years, and probably longer than that. The strategies and the tactics and the information gathering, the marshaling of volunteer troops, this has all been like a battle, and it's been a battle that's not over yet. We still have a lot to go, a long ways to go. And you know, a remarkable thing happened in the rest of the country as the bills started to move through Congress. People put aside important environmental concerns in their states and neighborhoods to focus their time and energy on getting ANILCA passed. It would not have happened. It could not have happened if it hadn't been for all those people, those hundreds of thousands of people who wrote the letters to their representatives, to the newspapers, to magazines, and talked to their friends and neighbors about how important protecting Alaska's special places was to them and is to them as they still do this to protect the Arctic Refuge. This is a debt that can never be repaid and for which we are eternally grateful. We've heard from and about so many of the heroes of ANILCA. I'd like to talk about one other set of heroes. Through the 70s, the number of environmental organizations in Alaska were few. The Fairbanks Environmental Center, which is now the Northern Alaska Environmental Center, Center for the Environment, Southeast Alaska Conservation Council, and Alaska Conservation Society. Friends of the Earth and Sierra Club were here too. The full-time staff were virtually non-existent. Jim Kowalski had 2 hats. He got a paycheck from Friends of the Earth and one from the Environmental Center in Fairbanks. And of course, Jack Hessian was the full-time representative for Sierra Club here. It was not an easy time for them. I remember at one time Jack had sugar put in his gas tank, and I think there have been several tires that lost their air involuntarily. We don't have billboards in Alaska, so we use our bumper stickers as a way to express our opinions. I imagine a number of you remember Sierra Club Go Home and Let the Bastards Freeze in the Dark. I must admit I recently succumbed to expressing myself on my bumper. I have proudly and still wear proudly, "Don't blame me, I voted for Fran." I mentioned the paucity of staff to emphasize the enormity of the undertaking when in 1976, Alaskan environmentalists engaged with national organizations like Sierra Club, Wilderness Society, and Friends of the Earth, and a few other nationals at that beginning point to really push for the fulfillment of the promise of the D2 section of ANSCA. This collective effort was not always smooth. We understood in Alaska the importance of including protection of subsistence language in the Act and had to convince national environmental organizations that it was in our best interest, in the interest of getting the bill passed, and certainly in the interest of Native Alaskans to make sure that that was part of the bill. I think this oftentimes gets forgotten in our discussions with people about the subsistence section. Nor was it easy for some of the environmental organizations in Alaska. The subsistence section really tore the Alaska Conservation Society apart, and shortly after 1980, it was actually disbanded. Fortunately, we have a number of the local groups that were part of the Conservation Society, still very active and effective. And now we look to the next 25 years. The issues are many and daunting, but I have no doubt that environmentalists, individually and collectively, will meet the challenges. With mentors like Ed Wayburn, and with young people like Werner and Katie and the rest of the AYA, Alaska Youth for Environmental Action, the future is in good hands. Let's go away from this celebration knowing that we have accomplished something truly amazing and magnificent. We joined together in an incredible dream and made it happen. I thank you, Alaska thank you, and future generations thank you.
Dr. Ed Wayburn will be 99 years young in September. He graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1930. He served in the U.S. Air Force in the 1940s. He first visited Alaska with his beloved wife, Peggy, in 1967. And he has been here scores and scores of time since, mostly with Peggy, but also since Peggy's death. Dr. Wayburn was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1999, the highest civilian award that can be awarded in the United States. He was, as we all have heard repeatedly, absolutely instrumental in the passage of ANILCA, in his role as president of the Sierra Club, and in his role as a doctor and as a person of great commitment and conviction. As I mentioned yesterday, his and Peggy's endowment fund at the Alaska Conservation Foundation recently exceeded $1 million and will be used in their names to fund work by the best conservation organizations to protect ANILCA forever, forever. Needless to say, Dr. Ed Wayburn is one of the greatest conservationists the world has ever known, and one of my greatest heroes and friends. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for that overkind introduction. For this conference and for the American people as a whole, I want to acknowledge the deep debt that we all owe to President Jimmy Carter and Secretary of the Interior Cecil Anderson. President Carter stands out as a hero in high office, a person who understood the importance of saving so much of the beauty and magnificence that is Alaska. I would also like to honor the long and sustained efforts of those Alaskans who appreciated the value of these lands to Americans themselves, as well as to the people of all America. There are those such as Richard Gordon, David Mark Hickok, Celia Hunter, and others who were working for Alaskan conservation before Peggy and I first arrived in Alaska. And of course, there are the stalwarts of the Alaska Conservation Society, such as Bob Whedon and Jenny Wood. There were congressional representatives such as Morris Udall, John Seiberling, and Phil Burton, and senators such as Alan Bible, Henry M. Jackson, Lee Metcalf, Paul Tsongas, and John Durkin. And last but not least, Secretary of the Interior Roger Martin and his Assistant Secretary Nathaniel Reed. Then there are those whom the Sierra Clubs recruited from 1967 to 1980, notably Jack Hessian, Chuck Cluson, Doug Scott, and John McComb, and the hosts of Alaska natives who contributed in a variety of ways to the success of the legislation. All these and many more I don't have time or immediate recollection to recognize right now had their own important roles in the campaign for the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. Personally, I've been to Alaska some 35 times after my wife Peggy first convinced me to come. I'm indebted to my son-in-law, Jim Rausch, who flew me and Peggy and Jack Hessian around the state a number of times. In my own many years of Alaska and other conservation campaigns, I have come to see a general pattern in environmental advocacy. First comes a vision, then an obsession to do the job so that the vision will endure. Among these are choose your targets and don't be diverted. Always consider long range as well as short-term objectives. Keep the land from being chopped up. The entire watershed must be protected. Early compromise is the downfall of any conservation campaign. Ask for less than your goal at the start, and you'll end up with little. Ask for what you desire at the start, and most likely you'll end up with less than the optimum, but it will always be closer to the mark. Environmental organizations must present a united front whenever possible. Internal disputes are best kept behind the scenes. There is no easy excuse for Congress to avoid action than the opportunity to say, if you guys can't make up your minds, how are we supposed to? And once you have taken hold of a project, follow through. Campaigns enter different phases and reach climaxes, but they go on and on and on. The Alaska Conservation Act remains the largest piece of land conservation legislation in American history. It provides in varying degrees protection for 104 million acres of Alaska lands and waters. And yet, at its passage, and even now, a quarter of a century later, I do not feel completion. The campaign for Alaska lands reached an important plateau in 1980, but not an end. I doubt if it ever will end. A conservation campaign like this never really ends. It crosses certain milestones, but wild lands must always be defended against those who would encroach against their ecological integrity. Permanent protection of many of Alaska's unparalleled, unique wildlands may not seem close today, but the vision of them, the vision of preserving them in perpetuity remains. Thank you.
And now for our last two speakers. 25 years from now, when we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Anilka, I am sure they are going to be at the head table yet again. The first speaker is Katie Gavanis. Katie just graduated from high school this year. She has been nominated for several leadership awards and is the outgoing chair of the Homer Alaska Youth for Environmental Action. She recently compiled a statewide booklet entitled Wild Places, Our Heritage, Our Future, Our Voice, which will be published this summer. Katie is a great leader. And our final speaker is Werner Wilson III. Werner was born and raised in Dillingham, Alaska. He is Yupik. He graduated, He graduated in 2004 and completed his first year at Brown University as an environmental studies major. He was an active participant in Alaska Youth for Environmental Action. He was the recipient last fall of the Denny Wilshire Award for the most outstanding high school student in the state for the environment. He is an ACF intern this summer, and he is another future leader. Katie?
bit nervous. Eating in front of all you was actually nerve-wracking enough for the week. But here goes. Good afternoon. My name is Katie Aspen-Gavanis, as Deborah said, and I'm truly honored to be here today with all of you. And I thank you for being here. I thank you for the work that you've done with ANILCA. And I especially thank Deborah and ACF for putting on this event, but also for your continued support of AYA. I've lived in Homer, Alaska all my life, so I've been lucky enough to enjoy many of the benefits of ANILCA, even though it happened before I was born. Even so, I didn't have a clue what ANILCA was until someone signed me up for this event, and I started working at the Alaska Islands and Ocean Visitor Center, which houses the headquarters of the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, ANILCA lands, as you all know. So now, I at least know what ANILCA stands for, and a little bit about it, but I am sure that most everyone in this room knows far more than I do about ANILCA and land conservation in Alaska. There is little that I can share with you on these subjects that you don't already know, but here I am, standing in front of all of you. So excuse me if I go a little bit off topic at first, but there is only one subject that I can almost guarantee I know more about than you all do: my personal experiences in Alaska. As I mentioned previously, I was born in Homer, Alaska 18 years ago. For the first 10 years of my life, my family lived in a rustic cabin without electricity and running water. On the bluffs of Kachemak Bay, our cabin was surrounded by forests and fields of wildflowers. This is where my sister, Erica, and I spent most of our time, exploring rotting logs, searching for berries, climbing trees. We eagerly discovered the wonders of the natural world. We could spend hours watching a squirrel stash away spruce cones or examining shrimp-like creatures in a nearby pond, playing monkey family in the alder trees, or searching for fiddlehead ferns for a snack. We uncovered new wonders every single day. Nature never failed to amaze and fascinate us. We grew up immersed in the world of plants, animals, and imagination. Erica and I were lucky. Every child desires and deserves such opportunities to explore and discover the magic of wild places and wild things. Now going back as far as I remember, I find myself in Homer on Good Friday, 1989. Most of you, like me, sadly remember this date when the Exxon Valdez ran aground in Prince William Sound. 2.5 years old at the time, I was not old enough to completely comprehend what was going on. But I do remember the anxiety in there. Something bad was happening. I could tell even though I didn't have any idea what an oil spill really was. I remember driving up to the top of a nearby hill to look down on the mouth of Kachemak Bay and Cook Inlet, searching for the bad blackness that everyone feared would come around the corner. But rather than just sitting around and morosely waiting, the town of Homer took action. People volunteered in the cleanup crew, worked to prevent oil from spreading, helped rehabilitate animals. Even I got to participate in a little way, a very meaningful experience for me. I had the chance to donate my baby blanket to an otter that had been oiled. I didn't need it anymore, and the otter really did. I still vividly remember walking behind the middle school, where a makeshift animal cleaning and rehabilitation center had been set up, a mess of crates, tubs, otters, birds, and lots of dedicated volunteers. Although I didn't know what exactly was going on, I made the connection between the bad blackness and these sick animals. I remember feeling profound sadness, but also the goodness of being able to help out and push back that blackness just a little bit. This experience, being able to contribute something, was extremely empowering. Every child should have opportunities to affect their natural world for the better. As I grew older, I learned more about the Exxon Valdez oil spill and the environment. I came to understand the fear, anger, and mourning that I had sensed in 1989. Through school, work, and recreation, I learned more about public lands in Alaska and protecting the environment. In high school, I got involved with Alaska Youth for Environmental Action. The mission of this amazing program is to inspire, educate, and take action on environmental issues facing our communities for the youth of Alaska. I was very lucky to become a part of this group. I already had the passion and understood the wonder of wild places. AYA gave me the tools and skills necessary to take action. Through school, AYA, and work at the Islands and Ocean Visitor Center and the Maritime Refuge, I've had the opportunity to meet and work with so many inspiring adults, teens, and children who have a passion for conservation. I thank them wholeheartedly. Without the support and knowledge of teachers, conservationists, coworkers, and peers, I would not be doing this today. With a network of dedicated people supporting them, every person can achieve great things in the field of conservation and beyond. So, here I am, speaking to all of you about my past, not exactly following the topic of looking to the future. But in fact, as I stand here, looking out at all of you, I am looking to the future. You have the ability to shape the future of wildlands in Alaska and the environment in general. We all know that you have already done so, putting in long hours and fighting hard fights to get to this momentous milestone. But as you all know as well, it is far from over. This is one struggle that will continue for generations, will continue forever, which means that the future also lies in the hands of high school students examining salmon roe under a microscope, of preschoolers peering at sea stars and tide pools, of babies watching butterflies land on wildflowers. Because of this, we must give children the opportunity to discover the wonder of nature, whether it be a beetle on a dandelion in the front yard or a pristine alpine lake at dawn. A child knows how amazing the world is. We must give them the chances to explore it. A child knows what the right thing to do is. We must give them the chances to do it. We must encourage all children to take action. By doing so, we affirm what the children already know, that wild places and wild things are special and deserve protection, that individuals can do something to ensure that protection, that they can be friends of the loon again, as Tom Barron's daughter so eloquently put it. As children grow older, we must let them explore more and give them the knowledge and information they crave about the environment. Encourage them to become leaders, support their projects, give them the tools necessary to succeed, and always, always foster that sense of awe and wonder inspired by all things wild. Thus, the next generation of great conservation leaders will become adults. 25 years from now, they may sit at an event like this, perhaps thinking that their work is complete. But their job will not be finished, just as yours is not. Don't worry, there is still much work to be done, and we are the ones that must do it. Yes, sometimes the work is tiring, sometimes it seems never-ending, but it is also important and amazing, inspiring and empowering. As you leave here today and make your way outside into the pretty fresh Anchorage air, I'm spoiled living in Homer, please take a moment to consider what you have accomplished and the work you continue today. Think about why you do this, the wonder of out there. Then take a little time to get out there again. Lie under a tree in your backyard. Jog at dawn on a scenic back road. Hike deep into the backcountry where perhaps no one has ever been before. Recapture that wonder you felt as a child. Let yourself be fascinated by the smallest creature, the most towering mountains. Enjoy our wild places and wild things. Then share not only your knowledge and experience, but also your passion and wonder with others, both young and old. This is how the future of our wild places will be ensured. Knowledge, experience, passion, and most importantly, wonder. Thank you for creating Anilka and defending it. Together, we can carry the legacy of Anilka and wild places everywhere into the future for generations to enjoy.
Thank you, Katie. That was a really awesome speech. I also want to thank Deborah very much. She's the greatest boss I've ever had, and even though I haven't had many. And all my coworkers at ACF have made my internship such a great experience so far. I'm so proud to be a part of this team. I'm honored and privileged to be here today with you all. Thank you all so much. As we are ready to depart, we all leave knowing that the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, creating millions of acres of wilderness in Alaska, has a great impact on our nation. Personally, this is what Anilka means to me. A stands for Alaska Youth. I have a niece and two nephews, Raquel, James, and Connor, who are sitting over there on the far left, my left at least. And they remind me of why we have ANILCA, and that is so they have a prosperous future from the bountiful resources in our parks, refuges, and monuments that will be handed to them. N stands for our nation. Our nation came together to recognize that we needed ANILCA so that God's beauty could be preserved forever. I stands for intelligence. Everyone who pushed for ANILCA had a deep inner passion, understanding, and intelligence of how this act would pour prosperity deep into the future. L stands for love. For the love that Alaska Natives had for the land thousands of years ago, to the love that every American from all walks of life has for it today. And L is also for the life that the wilderness and wildlife give to us, for the love and life of a thriving subsistence culture in which ANILCA ensures an indefinite future. C stands for President Carter. Duh. His great leadership ensured that ANILCA would properly fit the great land, a culture, and the people that inhabit it. And he surely has left a lasting legacy. Today, Alaskan towns are reaping countless benefits from the designated wildlands through tourism, and rural peoples are still able to live off the land. Thank you so much, President Carter. And finally, A stands for always. We have a responsibility to ensure that ANILCA will always be there for future generations. For with ANILCA, there will always be bountiful wildlife, unspoiled wilderness, and renewable resources for our nation. Thank you.
Thank you all for making this conference such an incredible success. Thank you, ACF staff. Thank you, Hilton and your wonderful union staff. Thank you, sponsors. Thank you, honorary host and organizing committees. Thank you, speakers. Oh, the speakers. Thank you, everyone who attended this conference. And I want to give a special thank you and presentation who worked for the last 14 months to ensure that the logistics of this conference were flawless. Sherry Showalter, could you come up, please? She also got one of the signed Jimmy Carter posters. Okay, let's see, it's 12:02. We still have 4 hours in this day to make the partnerships that have been described, to inspire the youth, to continue to inspire one another, to work hard to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and to do all the other work that must be done to protect ANILCA forever. And we need to get started right about now. Fundamentally, the passage and defense of ANILCA represents an exceptional story of hope, effectiveness, and conservation success, which stands as a tribute to the vision and dedication of all involved, and an inspiration to all who follow. Thank you, heroes, past, present, and future. Thank you all. Okay, get going. Thank you all.